Bună seara, doamnelor și domnilor! Vă mulțumim că sunteți alături de noi. Ascultați Radio AVTM, Vocea Europei.
Jó estét, hölgyeim és uraim! Köszönjük figyelmüket! Önök az a Voice Former Rádió Európa hangja műsorát hallgatják.
And, good evening ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in. You are listening to A Voice for Men Radio, the voice of Europe. A Voice for Men is the flagship of the men's rights movement. And this show is probably the only one at this point addressing the issues concerning men and boys at a European level. If you ever thought that there's something wrong regarding the state's approach to men and their issues, this is the best place to start. This is the place where feminism gets to be called out on its lies and propaganda, and the state is invited to get out of people's lives. Please consider visiting avoiceformen.com and see how the truth in action sounds like. We are here and we don't plan on leaving anytime soon. And now, Lucian Vâlsan shall bring us on today's topic.
And we're back. Everyone, this is Lucian Vâlsan broadcasting from Cluj-Napoca, Transylvania. And as always, alongside with me is Herr Jon Gunnarsson broadcasting from Deutschland, and our producer James Huff broadcasting from the US. Greetings, gentlemen. Hi there, Jon.
Good evening. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. I'm still trying to cope with this wave of heat that seems to be quite bizarre. I mean, it's not sunny, it's cloudy, but it's still extremely hot. Sorry. So yeah, I'm still trying to cope with that.
Lend us some heat. But yeah, it's actually been quite sunny the last 2 weeks, but today it's sort of overcast and generally quite cold, and maybe 5 degrees extra. That would be nice.
Yeah, that would be nice. Well, in here yesterday there was something like 36 degrees, but no sun, so it was almost unbreathable, and that was quite unpleasant. On the other hand, well, maybe I should be thankful that there is no sun, because there's a lot of construction working being done on the roads, and more sun would just make things worse for everyone. Okay then, I guess given that we are in a much tighter schedule because we need to fit in Mike as well, we might go to the news.
You are listening to AVFM Radio, the voice of Europe. This is the news.
Okay, the first piece of news is from Reason magazine. Campus nags want to change how male students think. Imagine if radical left-wing students were only allowed to play for their college football teams if they first agreed to attend a class designed to expunge their edgy thinking. We would consider that outrageous, a return of McCarthyism, an intolerable assault on the rights of students to think whatever they want. We'd call it thought policing. So why is there so little uproar about Oxford University's decision to make its rugby clubs undergo anti-sexism classes before being allowed to compete in major college tournaments? Replace radical left-wing students with rugby-playing students and red thinking with deadish banter, and the nightmare scenario described above is actually happening on a British campus. Students are being forced into thought-washing before being allowed to represent their colleges in sports. None of the rugby clubs at Oxford has been implicated in any crimes, but the university administration has nonetheless decided to make all of them sit through 1 hour anti-misogyny classes in an attempt to combat sexism on campus. Any rugby-playing student who refuses to be lectured about the rottenness of sexist thinking will be forbidden from playing in this year's Cuppers final, an annual clash of Oxford's various college rugby teams. That is, they're being strong-armed to submit themselves to a moral clear-out of their minds. Notably, the classes aren't designed to alter any problematic behavior. They're explicitly about transforming how these students think and speak. As one news report says, it's about educating these guys about the horribleness of their jokes and songs, which can be saucy and raucous and apparently make some women feel uncomfortable, and getting them to ditch their lad banter the rude chit-chat rugby guys are famous for indulging in. There's a word for this kind of thing: re-education. British universities no longer simply educate their students, adding bits of knowledge to their brains, they also re-educate them, removing apparently dodgy stuff from their minds. Oxford's rugby players aren't the only students being cajoled into moral re-education under the guise of combating misogyny. Indeed, on British campuses, lads are the new Reds. Across the UK, laddish students are being subjected to the kind of mind policing and moral censure that would cause a huge stink if it were applied to any other social group. Last October at the London School of Economics, LSE, the rugby club was disbanded for a year and its members were pressured by the LSE Students' Union in cahoots with university management to sign up for "good lad" discussion groups at which they are encouraged to fix their allegedly backwards ways of thinking. Only when the union and the university are satisfied that the rugby lads have been remade as "good lads" will the club be allowed to reform. What was the LSE rugby boys' crime, earning them this year-long bout of repentance and re-education? At the Freshers' Fair last October, they distributed a choky leaflet advertising the upcoming social events, which said that quote-unquote minges, English slang for ugly women, and quote homosexual debauchery were not welcome. For making this crass but ultimately harmless joke, they were denied the right to play college sports for a year and were pushed into anti-lad re-education. As part of their re-education program, students gather on public streets near the LSE holding placards saying, "a good lad," and then fill in the blank. A good lad frees himself of gender stereotypes. A good lad understands that feminism isn't a dirty word, and so on. To see these students holding up self-critical placards in public is extraordinary and sad. It's like something out of Mao's China, when disobedient professors and artists were likewise paraded in public with insulting placards, usually hung around their necks, identifying them as intellectual reprobates. Fast forward 50 years and students at LSE are being publicly identified as moral reprobates, sinners against the new orthodoxy of PC speech and feministic censure. The Oxford and LSE punishment of boorish speech is part of a broader culture war against lads on UK campuses. And often the war is led by students themselves, or certainly by students' unions that claim to represent the student body. The National Union of Students, NUS, the umbrella body for all students' unions, had a lad culture summit in 2014, really, to discuss how to hammer the alleged scourge of a laddish banter and behavior. Out of this summit came a national strategy on lad culture, which involves the NUS putting pressure on students' unions to clamp down hard on any displays of laddishness on their campuses. To that end, Edinburgh University SU introduced a policy to end lad banter on campus. Imagine the tyrannical arrogance it takes to believe you have the right to end an entire way of speaking. Cardiff University has an anti-lad culture policy, which aims to tackle the pack mentality fueled by heavy alcohol consumption that can give rise to banter and the use of gender, sexuality, and rape-based humor. Booze, gangs, tattoo-busting jokes. To some people that's a night out, not a moral crime. One person's evil banter is another person's perfectly acceptable larks. Cardiff's anti-lad culture policy was used to ban Dapper Laughs, a saucy comedian, from performing a gig on campus last year. This stuff has a directly censorious impact. In the name of clamping down on lad culture, other students' unions have banned Robin Thicke's blurred lines and even forbidden the making of sexual noises. Newcastle University Students' Union warned students against making unwelcome sexual invitations, like asking someone to dance, and, again, offensive sexual noises, which can include wolf whistling and catcalling. If you can't make an offensive sexual noise while you're a student, when can you do it? Under pressure from the NUS, more universities are adopting anti-lad policies. No matter how much PC gloss gets slathered on this war on lads, there's no disguising what it really is. Intolerance, plain and simple, of a particular way of thinking, speaking, and socializing. Now, the article goes on with a couple of US examples, but these are not really relevant for our purposes, so we'll leave it here for now. So, comments?
As I asked myself in public several times before, why do students put up with this bollocks? I mean, why don't students just stand up and say, no, you're not gonna do this, fuck this shit? I mean, seriously, students used to be the people who were the most obnoxious about disobeying authority. Why do students just roll over and swallow this mess? I mean, the comparison with China's Mao is quite apt. I mean, even back in the communism in here, it was still considered a bit too extreme, the Maoist example, to just put people to self-humiliate themselves in public. And mind you, this was Ceausescu talking. Yet now it is acceptable at Oxford? Why do students put up with this?
I think it's sort of part of that is that the political left and right are always perceived quite differently. What you're talking about, the student protests and so on, that was left-wing students standing up to sort of more right-wing administrations and policies and so on. And here we have basically the opposite. And I think this sort of lad culture is particularly vulnerable because it is not a political thing. This sort of your banter and so on is not meant to be serious. It's not so it's difficult to sort of mount a serious defense of it because it is in many ways, as the article puts it, is crass and so it's very difficult to sort of mount an intellectual defense of that sort of thing without coming across as sexist and so on.
Well, this is where the term political correctness comes in handy, because you can just attack the individuals or the policies meant to enforce political correctness without actually defending what is being attempted to be censored. I don't give a I don't give a flying tosh whether that lad thing is crass or not. It's not the purpose of the university to teach to force students into effectively re-education. It's just not the purpose. I mean, do those things occur during university classes? No, they don't. Then why the hell is the business of the university? And you probably know where I'm coming from, in the sense that, I mean, such initiatives were attempted in other places. In France, we read on this show. In Hungary, I remember in 2008 that the Central European University was also attempted. Yet such initiatives were just totally unsuccessful in Sorbonne or in Central European University. Why is it successful in Britain or in the US? Or why is it? What makes the English-speaking places more prone to not only attempt this, but to actually be successful in attempting such re-education measures?
I'm not entirely certain. I think maybe part of it is because universities in the English-speaking world tend to be sort of a more all-encompassing experience. There's more of this idea of campus life, and education is supposed to be more general. You're supposed to not just train specialists, but sort of educate citizens, and you have more broad courses and so on usually. So I think that's an important distinction. Whereas in much of the non-English speaking world, you go to university, you pick a particular subject and you just study that subject, and that's it. You don't have any courses on that teach you political correctness or whatever it is, unless this sort of stuff is part of the subject you're studying.
Mm-hmm. Or unless you specifically elect to have such courses, because you can elect to have extra courses, but yeah, they're not introduced everywhere. Although I suspect this is the same thing in the STEM fields. I mean, I could be wrong, but I think someone going to study robotics at MIT might not be subjected to politically correct classes. I could be wrong, but
Yeah, but even if you're studying something in the STEM field, for example, you often still have to take all sorts of other classes too, where some of them will be infected by this sort of politically correct thinking. Whereas in, say, Germany, for example, if you study engineering, you just go and you take engineering courses and courses on math and stuff like that, and you don't have to bother with any other classes.
Yeah, same here. I mean, but I've been for 1 year at mathematics and physics, and the only non-STEM class that was an English class in the first year, and that's it. Everything else was totally related to the topic. So yeah, this is sad. I don't know. I don't think there is a solution other than the students to just start standing up to these bullies. Or in the case of Oxford, Oxford is a private university. I mean, maybe some boycotts would be in order, although I suspect that will never happen for obvious reasons. Okay, let's go to the next one. The next one is from my backyard. Romanian president wants to be the nice guy and he fails. Did you know that May 8th was the Equality of Opportunity between Women and Men Day? The Romanian president, Klaus Iohannis, was very preoccupied on Friday to announce this aspect. Seizing on this opportunity, the president also announced us that he joins the latest feminist ideological fashion of the United Nations, namely the international campaign #HeForShe. It is true that in Romania the president has more prerogatives than in Hungary or Germany, but it is also true that the president has fewer prerogatives than in presidential republics such as the United States or Belarus. In other words, such ideological commitments would be preferable to reside at the bottom of the presidential agenda, if they are to reside at all, lagging behind some far more important aspects such as overseeing the enforcement of the Constitution or the national defense policy. But this doesn't happen. Klaus Iohannis is far more preoccupied with making ideological commitments. What's funnier is that the president's message somehow still managed to offend the gender ideologue's sensibility because, you see, Iohannis' message objectifies women. Andreea Molocea, vice president of a feminist association and PhD candidate for the School of Multicultural Feminist Indoctrination, known better to the public as SNSPA, explains to us simpletons in the Adevărul newspaper. Quote, respect for those around us is a virtue. This is how the president starts his message, and after the comma, he mentions equality of opportunity. In other words, the president says that respect for women is a virtue. In other words, women are those around us. Women are the object and men are the subject. And we pay for this individual to get a PhD so she can write more garbage like this and do it under a veneer of authority. So much for patriarchy. And she goes on, quote, the problem with the patriarchy is that it exceeds the domain of laws, rights, and policies. These are just the tip of the iceberg of men's domination over women. The true domination comes exactly with this type of behavior, these subtle underminings, these reduction of us women from the center to the outskirts, from the heart till epidermis. End of quote. Aren't you feeling better for paying for the studies of this lady? Isn't it great that our taxes, mostly paid by men, are ideally used to pay for the studies of a lady who is then once again paid to write garbage about men? This move of President Iohannis and the disproportionate reactions of the feminist ideologues were kinda expected. We say this because the feminist ideologue-in-chief of this country, Mihaela Miroiu, coincidentally also part of SNSPA, offered her public endorsement for Klaus Iohannis even from the first round, when also two women were in the race, arguing that Monica Macovei is not appropriate for the job because she doesn't believe in social justice. Miroiu said at the time, quote, she has a program that doesn't intersect at all with my preferences regarding justice with three eyes open, not with both eyes blindfolded. Justice and fairness aren't identical. As a president, she should deal with social justice, not just justice, period, end of quote. In other words, the judiciary's impartiality, because that's what it's all about when goddess Justitia is blindfolded, is not part of the feminist plan. Equality under the law is the antithesis of feminism, an aspect which those of us in the politically activated non-feminist sector already know. The upside of this whole deal is that the public didn't react well at all to the president's move. Considering that Mr. Iohannis was considered by most analysts as the president of the Facebook generation, we consider the reactions he got on his Facebook page to be relevant. Let's review a few of those. One commenter said, Mr. President, you're out of your mind, and I'm sorry to say so. This is your concern. You're unrecognizable when compared to the Your Highness I voted for in November, and you're in free fall. Another commenter adds, if not even now there's no equality between men and women, then when? In fact, women have already surpassed men in rights. And another commenter adds, I'm sorry for voting for you, Mr. President. And it goes on like that for several thousand comments. These people are not EVFM members, nor militant anti-feminists, not even members of the opposition political parties. These people are average citizens of this country, most of them having voted for Mr. Iohannis in the last elections. For the president of the Facebook generation, this doesn't look good at all. But is Klaus Iohannis a misandric ideologue? The most complete answer that we can give is, we don't know yet. Internationalist feminism is always disseminated first using the ignorance of various decision makers, as well as using their misplaced good intentions. But ignorance of the real danger that gender ideology represents for the society does not and should not excuse the president. As head of state, he doesn't have the right to be ignorant, nor the right to be only half informed. This move will cost Mr. Iohannis votes, and quite a few of them. Now, the article that I wrote was a bit longer than that, but that's probably the gist of it. What is surprising is that the storm prolonged on the president's Facebook page, even long after I wrote this article and long after his first replies to it, and then he posted something else related to a totally different and unrelated topic, and the comments were still about why did he have to join he for she when that's not a good idea and things of that nature. I was genuinely surprised by the reaction of the public, and pleasantly surprised, I might say.
Yeah, it all seems surprising to me. I mean, that people would be very much against what this woman who's was criticizing the president. I mean, that doesn't surprise me at all. But that people, I mean, the sort of statements that that Iohannis made there seemed to me not really all that offensive even, and sort of very mainstream sentiment. So it's very surprising that so many people are voicing such an that so many people are voicing their opposition so vehemently.
Yeah, well, essentially the opposition came from at least three portions. That's how I would group. I mean, the tiniest portion is the feminist sector, who thought that Iohannis's message was offensive, which I don't think it was. I mean, it was offensive, but not the way she described it. I mean, come on, to accuse him of objectifying women because he said respect for those around us is a good idea. Come on, that's that's too extreme. Then there was the largest sector, which was essentially we don't give a flying tosh about Emma Watson and he for she and whatnot. It's not your job as a president to do such commitments. But however, it is your job to be involved in this and this and this. And there were like three different big scandals in which his opinion is yet to be heard of until today. And that's his constitutional responsibility there. He for she is not a constitutional responsibility of the president. And then there was the other segment of people who just said, no, we just strongly disagree, because, you know, there is being the president of the Facebook generation has its drawbacks. You know, most of your public tends to be quite informed. and the public just went on and read Emma Watson's statement, and most of them just found out about it from the president and said, Mr. President, you're wrong. You shouldn't be supporting this.
Yeah, that's definitely good news. But on the reaction from the sort of radical feminists, that just goes to show you once again that while appeasement may be a good strategy in many situations, it does not work when you're dealing with Nazis or social justice warriors.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, let's go to the next one.
Okay, this one is from Die Presse from Austria. Sex ed in schools, worse than groping bottoms. Sexual harassment of children in schools is not a crime, but is encouraged by the minister. Online poll to legitimize this after the fact. A 9-year-old schoolgirl comes home in tears. That morning, sex ed was in the curriculum. A doctor had been invited, but parents hadn't received detailed information. The girl reports her disgust when being made to put a condom onto a banana. But all this is nothing compared to what German children are being subjected to in many Bundesländer since the introduction of the new sex ed program. In Germany, kindergartens were equipped with snuggling pits in which children are encouraged to masturbate. In primary schools, sex toys are distributed and all sorts of sexual practices are described in detail, leading some children to be severely distraught and others to imitation. After widespread protestations of parents, Baden-Württemberg has withdrawn this initiative. Parental resistance is also forming in Austria, where there is now a separate platform for this protest. While Minister Gabriele Heinisch-Hosek wanted to tighten laws against sexual harassment for adults, her new decree on sex ed will force children to endure things like that in school. The sex educationist Tabea Freitag talks about, quote, sexual harassment of pupils, unquote. It seems only logical that this won't prevent child abuse, but through acclimatization will indeed facilitate such practices. There can be no doubt that a reasonable form of sex education in school is an important supplement to the sex education provided by parents. But the current proposal goes much farther than that and affects even children in primary school. On the teacher's orders, children are supposed to learn the following. Quote, enjoyment and pleasure from touching one's own body, parentheses, early childhood masturbation. Quote, discovering your own body and genitals. Quote, sexual feelings, parentheses, closeness, lust, arousal, as part of general human feelings. End quote. Some things which in and of themselves are positive and neutral are perverted into their opposite through a completely inappropriate environment. The basis of this proposal is the ideology of gender mainstreaming, i.e. the dissolution of the sexes and the questionable sex education theory of the controversial German sex educationist Uwe Seelert. And the article goes on a bit longer after that, but I think that's sufficient to get the gist of it.
Do you know who that author mentioned in the article is? I had never heard his name before.
No, sorry, it's the first time I heard his name as well.
Yeah, okay. So I guess I'll have to do more reading on that. On the other hand, what the hell is going on? I mean, similar deal has been trying in France, in Italy. That's what we covered. Now Germany and Austria. Why? What's going on? I mean, why? Where does this coming from?
Yeah, I don't really understand it completely myself, to be honest. I don't know what has prompted this. I mean, on the one hand, you don't want to go to the opposite extreme, like it's happening in some places in the US where you have abstinence-only sex education and so on. So we don't want to go to that extreme, but I mean, sorry, but 9-year-old children don't need to know how to put on condoms.
Yes.
Just, but I'm really not quite sure why this is being pushed by many people in the educational establishment. I guess sort of part of it is this idea of promoting alternative lifestyles and other kinds of sexuality and LGBT issues and so on, and sort of a lot of this controversy in Germany has been about that, where proponents of these proposals accuse their opponents of being bigoted and homophobic and so on, whereas the opponents just say that they don't want young children to be exposed to this sort of thing. So
I don't think it's anything homophobic to say. Can you please not talk about masturbation and how to put a condom to my 9-year-old? Thank you. I don't think that's
Yeah,
bigoted at all.
and I don't really know that it's good that 10-year-old boys are being made to perform um, anal sex pantomimically, or sort of to mime doing that in class. Why? Why do you need to do that?
That's totally inappropriate. I mean, look, uh, despite the image of quite conservative that I usually project some many cases without my will, I'm quite open with a lot of stuff. I mean, for instance, I commenced my sex life at 14, and by the current laws, I was a victim of rape, where I would definitely disagree with such a statement, even though the law disagrees with me, but that's a different story. But going from that until such outrageous thing. I mean, I'm thinking of myself at the age of 10, and that such thing would just be inconceivable. And I don't think it is. I don't think it really is. I don't think it's healthy for such very young children to be exposed to such things. And forget about the appropriateness or the morality of it. 10-year-old children haven't gone through puberty yet. They can't understand the notions themselves. They just can't. And that should be reason enough not to introduce it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's one thing to to answer questions if children have them, and some children
Absolutely.
develop faster than others and so on, and if they have questions about sexuality, these questions should be answered, and they should be answered forthrightly. But you don't need to push these things on children that just are not ready for that yet.
Yes, absolutely. And I think in this regard, probably Netherlands seems to be having the best model so far. I mean, in the Netherlands, as young as 11 or 12, you can actually go to some cabinet within all schools. All schools in Netherlands have them, and you can require a condom or things of that nature. And you can go and ask questions about pretty much anything, and literature is available. But it's voluntary basis, I mean, the kids don't have to hear that in the classroom. They can go and ask questions, either a few of them as a group or in private, and get all the information and protection that they need. The Dutch government works under the presumption of kids were gonna have sex. As long as they start puberty, they become sexual beings, and they will want to have sex, and some of them will actually do it. So we have a choice to make as a public policy. We can pretend it doesn't happen, or criminalize it, as the United Kingdom does, or as the United States does, or we can just acknowledge the fact and try to deal with it in the sense that, oh, well, if they're going to have sex at the age of 14, at least they should damn well be protected and avoid contracting diseases and whatnot. And if you look at the statistics in the sense of, I don't know, teen pregnancy rate, STD infections on teenagers, Netherlands is usually either the first or the second in Europe in these indicators. Why can't everyone just use that model? Because at least that one works, and nobody is complaining about it.
Yeah, that seems a much more reasonable model to me.
I mean, Jesus Christ. And again, this is still the part that will, the kind of question that will bother me until I'll either find an answer or a proper, or at least a semi-sound explanation. Where is this coming from? Because it's not just the Austrian education establishment or the German one. It's popping up almost everywhere, and all of those have been popping up in the last year. Maybe it's not coordinated, but something is there. There is some ideological current going through through various teacher groups or unions and whatnot.
I don't have a good explanation, but sort of one theory that pops to my mind is that it's just basically a sort of a reflexive rejection of on the part of the left wing of right wing thought, right? You have more right-wing, more conservative people tend to be against this sort of early sex education, and they want to prevent teenagers from having sex and so on. So maybe it's just that people on the left just try to signal that they are against all that repressive and backwards thinking and so on by being especially progressive and being especially interested in promoting child sexuality and
everything
so
that's
on.
taboo. Yeah, in breaking everything that's taboo. That would make sense if we wouldn't have all these Labour and the other leftist politicians all over Europe whining that we live in an over-sexualized culture. Well, decide your pick one. I mean, if you're I mean, recently was Harriet Harman in the UK whining that our girls are being raised and harmed in this over sexualized culture. Well, okay, but then why are you in favor of all these things? And I'm pretty sure Austria
I guess if it's being really cynical, you could say that they're producing the over-sexualized culture so that they can then rail against it, and it's sort of a perpetual motion machine of outrage and political capital.
Sounds like perpetual revolution. You might be closer to the truth than you initially intended. Okay, let's go to the next one. Coming from Norway, from nrk.no, sender Jytte barn til Trondheim for omskjæring. Boys now sent to Trondheim for circumcision. Since the end of last year, all public hospitals in Norway are required to offer ritual circumcision, but the northern part of the country has made that impossible to get because the doctors have refused. Our own surgeons will not do this procedure, and there is no private offer available either. Luckily, the Health Central Authority said that they will help us in Trondheim, says the technical director of the Northern Health Agency, Geir Tololi, for NRK. He describes the whole thing as an extraordinarily complex case. Only recently an opportunity has been offered at St. Olav Hospital. They started conducting male circumcision there and can receive referrals from our region. But also in Trondheim there is some reluctance to carry out the procedure. We cannot force anyone to perform a procedure that is not medically necessary. It is completely unreasonable, but we still have people who will perform it, said Øystein Drivenes, who is the chief physician at the infant surgery department at the St. Olav Hospital. In central Norway, confirms technical director Kjell Salvesen that they have been given green light to also accept patients from northern Norway. We will not look at geography when we get referrals for male children to be circumcised. Prerequisite is that the Northern Health Agency covers the costs, says Salvesen. Each year, approximately 2,000 male children are circumcised in this country, a ritual that is practiced among both Jews and Muslims. Since the end of last year, the procedure should only be done at public hospitals to ensure safety. Many in the scientific community are staunchly critical to the idea of performing surgery on healthy male children, and the hospitals in Bodø and Tromsø have put up a great resistance to the policy to the extent that nobody who tried was able to persuade them. So far, we have not received any signals that they will change their minds. There is a clear position from both the surgeons and the management in Bodø and Tromsø. Up north, according to Tuloli, a handful of boys have been placed on an indefinite waiting list since there is no practical way to actually get an offer in their area. We have taken the necessary steps to get them notified that they can send references to Trondheim, and they are taken in turn. This is not a group that is in high priority, though, but doctors there will attempt to take care of them after they've had conversations with both parents and got both of their consent. Has there been any talk about the age of the children? Asked the reporter. Yes, they should be more than 1 year old, added Tuloli. I have to admit that I'm starting to like more and more what the doctors in Tromsø and Bodø are doing in Norway. This is the kind of a follow-up. We've been tracking this for quite some time now, and I have to admit that this thing never crossed my mind. I mean, I was thinking, no, you just make it illegal for children under a certain age, let's say 14, or 16, and that's it. But this thing never crossed my mind to just don't try to make a huge fuss of it, but then block it using indefinite bureaucracy, which is kind of characteristic to the Scandinavian nations, and particularly to Norway.
Yeah, I'm not sure how well it will really continue to work, because I mean, as far as I understand it, these surgeons refusing to do these procedures are breaking the law. So I guess eventually.
They're not. They're not, because according to, and it's been said even in the article, you just can't force the doctors, and it's not in their. Think of it like abortion. Legally you can refuse a patient for abortion because potato, and the state can't intervene into that, because that's how the contracts were made. And in here there is even a scientific reason. Look, this is a healthy child. Why the hell would I perform surgery? So they're not breaking the law, because their contract is quite clear, and since they have unionized contract for indefinite periods, it's kind of quite difficult to edit their contracts, so to speak, or to update them. So this could work, not necessarily indefinitely, but for at least 10 years, and to create enough shenanigans. But I still think the method of action is laudable, for the simple aspect that the doctors have been unable to use their political influence to get it banned altogether, so they're now using their professional influence to reduce the number of circumcisions within Norway.
Yeah, it's definitely a good second best alternative.
Because I'm thinking it like this. I mean, if they can stall for several years in some cases, that might be enough to get the parents to change their mind. Or if they can stall enough in certain cases, for instance, parents that emigrate into Norway when the kid is 10 or something like that, and they can stall until the child is older, and then the child says no. Those are still individuals who will simply avoid being mutilated, and that's still a good thing. I mean, for doctors usually count their success in number of patients that they have saved, don't they?
Yeah, I guess so. So it's definitely good news.
Yep, definitely good news. I mean, I hope they manage to stall this for even longer period of time. I've read some local forums in Tromsø, and according to the folks living in there and who have relatives working in the hospital, this could go on for a decade at least. I hope they're right. Okay, then I guess let's go to the last one.
Okay, this one is from the FAZ, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, from Germany, and it's called Censors in the Lecture Hall. Anonymous students are blogging against professors at the Humboldt University of Berlin. They accuse the professors of arrogance and take notes of what they deem to be politically incorrect. How does the university react? Students are heaping abuse on a professor. They accuse him of arrogance and, quote, rhetorical superiority, which would be hilarious if the tone didn't continue becoming shriller. They denounce and censor his lectures, with which they are obviously intellectually outmatched, or at least that is the impression one gets when wading through their zealous blog entries. They attack under the cover of anonymity from a specially created campaign blog. No one knows who exactly is behind this, or if they are even students, whether they just came to Humboldt University as guest students, whether they attack a university teachers because their own strictly limited ideology obliges them to do so. It could be 10 persons or just one. No one has yet been able to tell. During this summer term, the quote-unquote enemy, as they call him, is political scientist Herfried Münkler. Past victims include the historian of Eastern Europe, Jörg Barbarowski, and the sociologist Michael Markopoulos. What all three of them have in common is that they are highly esteemed among the vast majority of students, and that they have charismatic personalities, which only the blog ideologues object to. In the case of the widely known political scientist Münkler, the attacks have now reached a style reminiscent of Stalinist censorship, even if their political discourse is probably more a product of the 70s. During the lectures, the bloggers take notes of what they deem politically incorrect. They decry the absence of gender-neutral language. They want to ban terms like peasants' language and even nation, because Herbert Münkler had only provided a, quote, description of the rubbish which most people even today have in their heads on the topic of the nation, unquote. Even more grotesque are accusations concerning the lecture on the history of political thought, in which Münkler is misquoted and his examples are changed to the opposite meaning to propel the outrage to new levels. They complain about the absence of African authors, yet another example of widespread Eurocentrism. They rejected as arrogant Münkler's comment that he would get to Franz Fanon in time, but that Fanon, while black, was from the island of Martinique and thus not an African. The anonymous bloggers style themselves victims of this, quote, militaristic extremists of the center, unquote, which they as pure-hearted students were exposed to. They accuse him of racism without condescending to supply evidence and label him a, quote, liberal pro-European with pan-German influences. They lament the professor's, quote, unlimited right to speak during his lecture and the salary, but they reject engaging in a panel discussion with him. He was too self-assured, they say. And it continues in this manner, but I think we get the main points here.
Oh my god, the professor is Eurocentric, teaching at a German university. I mean, that is in the heart of Europe. What?
Yeah, and this guy has the arrogance to have rhetorical superiority.
Which translated into plain English means he's right.
Or I guess that he is good at speaking, which is sort of important if you're a lecturer. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, he's a lecturer. Of course he's good at speaking. Ah, Jesus, fuck. My brain hurts.
Also, it's really terrible that he has an unlimited right to speak during his lecture.
Well, I don't think it's unlimited. I mean, a lecture is supposed to have a limited period of time, something like 2 hours at most.
Yeah, in the sense that, you know, during the lecture he can decide that, you know, he is speaking and not someone else.
Oh.
You know, if you're going to a lecture, what you usually expect is the lecturer to, I don't know, maybe lecture. Maybe that's why it's called that.
Yeah, I mean, is attendance to the lecture mandatory? I sincerely doubt so.
I don't know. It could be. I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, and if it is, I mean, I know that when we had a mandatory lecture, that was quite some time ago when I was in college, and I didn't like the particular presenter for various reasons. It doesn't really matter why right now. You know, you can just not listen. I mean, I had to get a Walkman with a tape back then to get some music to not hear the individual, but now it's significantly easier to just not listen to. If the attendance is mandatory, I sincerely doubt, but let's assume it is.
It's usually not in lectures, so.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus, and this objection, I really thought that we're slightly less subject to it, but I guess I was again way too naive. This objection, oh, there are no African authors. Well, the African authors, they're probably holding lectures in Nigeria. Just saying. I mean, you know, they have colleges in there, and some of them are quite good if you look at the international tables of universities.
I guess what they're talking about is the kinds of authors he cites, or the authors that you know, he deals with it in his course on, I think it was history of political thought.
Yeah, but
yeah, I think the reason is just that there just aren't very many significant African authors, at least since the Middle Ages. I mean,
yeah, I mean, if it's the history of political thought for the last 200 years, for instance, I genuinely have a significant problem problem thinking of an African author that has significantly contributed to the not evolution, but the modification of political thought, because we can't say that political thought has necessarily evolved. Sometimes it has devolved, unfortunately, like now, for instance. But I don't think there is one. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know. Maybe there is none.
Yeah, I can't think of anyone either. I mean, if you go back to the Middle Ages, you had, of course, it has of course have important thinkers in the Arab world, but in terms of modern history, I can't really think of anyone.
And I really don't understand this thing. Isn't university supposed to be the place? Let's presume that everything these individuals are accusing this professor for, let's presume everything is correct. Everything they say there is 100% true. I pretty much doubt about that, but for the sake of the argument, isn't the university the place where these ideas are supposed to be vetted?
Yeah, but here's the thing that I guess these, I would presume they are sort of radical left-wing students that are criticizing this professor. They're probably just so accustomed to everyone sort of pandering to their sentiments and to everyone to more or less agree with their worldview in academia, that they just can't handle it when someone is not just completely on their side. And I guess that's really the only way I can explain it, because I mean, as someone myself who's very far from being a leftist, and I can vouch that I'm at the university constantly confronted with all sorts of ideas that I find very offensive and that go very much against my beliefs, but that doesn't mean that I start some sort of hate blog because someone doesn't agree with me. It's absurd.
Or even worse, to demand that the lectures that offend you or go against your worldview be censored. What I found particularly funny was that part where, we find him offensive, but we don't want to engage in a panel discussion with him. I mean, really? When the feminist in chief of this country came to the University of Babes-Bolyai here in this city to hold a debate, she said, about feminism, I took extra steps to make sure that I would be there. And I went in there and wiped the floor with her, and essentially the debate was something like, ask the audience first if they agree with the premise, and then ask the audience after if they still agree with the premise, and I had the biggest sway of the vote. That's how you do it. If you disagree with something, you just go in there and challenge.
Yeah, but this guy has rhetorical superiority, so you can't really challenge him because he has the evil powers of rhetoric.
Well, she had rhetorical superiority as well. I mean, she was she was in academia for 20 years, and she was significantly more experienced than I was in such events. But that didn't stop me. And I said, well, if she's gonna wipe the floor with me, then I'm gonna prepare better, and next time I'll wipe the floor with her. But that didn't happen. So I mean, that's how I think of things. If at a public university someone comes in and I don't like, I go there and challenge them. If I really don't like them.
Yeah, but I guess it's just easier to just bitch and moan and complain in your blog.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Okay, Mike, I seems to be online, but come on, Mike, join us. I'm still waiting for Mike to come, and unfortunately for this episode, I was unable to find a song that is under Creative Commons that is also can cater to the technological limitations that Google bestows upon us.
Hi, Lucian.
Hello there, Mike. Welcome.
Good evening.
Thank you. God, I hate Google, the whole Google bloody platform. But okay, we're there.
It doesn't matter. We hate it too, and it's a kind of love-hate relationship that we have to maintain with Google. So in case everyone, although on this channel everyone should be quite familiar with Mike. Mike is the founder and president of the British political party Justice for Men and Boys.
I should say, sorry, Lucian. Could you call me party leader rather than president? We wouldn't use a word like president in the UK.
I see, and I like that. To be honest, I like that. I'm gonna memorize it and call it leader. Seriously, I like it because the European Union has with this model where everyone is a president and everyone is in charge, which in reality means that nobody is in charge. But that's a different story. Yeah. So Mike Buchanan's political party has participated in the last general elections in Great Britain. They had 2 candidates, and I guess we're now trying to to understand what happened and to I guess take some lessons. And personally, I'm very interested in this for the simple reason that it's kind of quite an ongoing study of mine, the psychology of masses and how cultures can shift and change. Because I've been through a massive cultural change a few decades ago. Oh my God. Sometimes I feel old, but anyway, let's go to my first question is: in the weeks leading to the elections day, you've encountered certain, let's call them shenanigans from the BBC, where they essentially try to wipe you out of existence, or when they eventually had no choice but to acknowledge your existence, to just foul your campaign and just block it as much as possible. And most of BBC's deeds were covered quite thoroughly by Breitbart. Were you surprised by this treatment?
I was appalled, but with the benefit of hindsight, I shouldn't have been surprised, Lucian. The BBC has for many years been a feminist propaganda broadcaster. They've given more exposure to the newly formed Women's Equality Party in 2 weeks here in the UK than they've given J4MB in 2 years. Shall I just run through exactly what the BBC did in Nottingham?
Yeah, please do, because I think it's amazing.
Okay. Well, we were standing in two highly marginal seats next to each other near Nottingham, and I guess about maybe 10-12 days before the election, my colleague who was standing in the other seat called me to say that he'd just learnt the previous evening that the BBC Radio Nottingham had held hustings. In other words, a broadcast program where all the candidates spoke over the course of an hour, and he hadn't been informed about it. And he'd heard on the grapevine that the hustings I was to do about a week later would be concerned with women's issues. And now I shouldn't have been surprised at that. Anyway, I called the BBC and they were kind of a bit sheepish, but it turned out that that not only was the audience going to mainly ask about women's issues, but it was to be an all-female audience, vetted by the BBC just in case they were concerned about men's issues, I guess. There was a young feminist presenter. And I was placed between the two female candidates, one of whom was the Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities. So they couldn't have shown more contempt for me. I can't think how they could have shown more contempt for me than that. Ray, my colleague, made a complaint to the BBC, and he had about 6 or 7 minutes a day or two before the general election. So they basically tried to wipe us out of any exposure on the local radio station.
Amazing. What is to me even more appalling, even by the BBC standards, is the response that this Breitbart journalist received when he emailed the BBC and asked, "What the hell were you doing? What the hell were you thinking?" And I'm quoting from the answer that this journalist received from the BBC. Quote, in these ways, Mr. Buchanan and Mr. Piero's campaigns are linked. Both have specific policies, whether it be, for example, changes to laws on abortion or changes to provision of childcare, which would have an impact on women. It is therefore editorially justified to unpick these issues in front of a female audience in a constituencies where such issues have been placed on the agenda by two candidates. Can you get more Orwellian than that?
It is Orwellian. It's really quite extraordinary, but it's very typical of the BBC. I mentioned we all the candidates had 1 minute at the beginning and 1 minute at the end to make a statement. So I made my statement to the effect that the presenter Sarah and her colleagues should be utterly damned ashamed of what they'd done, the manipulation that they'd done, and I referred to a complaint we'd made to the BBC about a year ago about a BBC Newsnight programme about domestic violence, in which, as usual, all the victims were women and all the perpetrators were men. And I took probably 2 or 3 days to write a complaint. And now the BBC editorial guidelines are 127 pages long. I found 54 breaches of the guidelines in that one programme, and they rejected the complaint.
Amazing.
With utter contempt.
Amazing.
You know, in fact, there was a woman, a female BBC employee at the hustings I went to, who said that having 100% female audience was justified because 52% of voters are women. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up.
Yeah, well, but by that standard, I guess next time when UKIP runs, we should have a 100% white audience, because 60% of the voters are white. It seems legit.
Well, I asked her, well, you know, if it happened that 52% of the voters were men, would that justify a 100% male audience? And she sort of, her face went a strange colour.
Too bad. In this country there is one county, one county where there is indeed 52% of the population is male. Too bad. I mean, that's what I would have done. I said we will hold the next hearing in that particular county, and I want my 100% male. I mean, if this reason, I mean, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, isn't it?
Yeah, it's true. But it is typical of the BBC. Everything that they do, they just will not recognise men's issues. So I mean, there was one even on suicide. There was one recently, a lengthy program about suicide, in which they interviewed at some length a woman called Jane Powell, who's the radical feminist head of a male suicide charity called the CALM Initiative, and CALM stands for the Campaign Against Living Miserably. Now, this is an organisation. I think she's been doing this for 6 or 7 years. This is an organisation that finances annual audits of masculinity, and her whole take is basically that if only men talked about their problems, then the suicide rate would crash. Now, I met her about a year ago, and she must be about the most vile feminist I've ever met. I can honestly say. And so I said, well, you know, how does talking help the man who's denied access to his children? How does talking help the man who's being beaten to a pulp by his wife every night? And she just stared at the table. She had no answers.
Yeah, this talking argument keeps killing me, because, you know, I looked into various European nations, and the suicide rate for men, although it was bigger than women's, it was significantly smaller 50 years ago or 70 years ago. And I'm thinking, if talking really helps that much, should we conclude that men talked more about their feelings in the 40s and 50s as opposed to 2015? And I think that's kind of a dumb question. I don't think that is the case.
Yeah,
So,
it's always the feminist narrative is so often about long-term mental health issues. Now, in the UK, the male-female suicide differential today is about 3.5 to 1. 30 years ago, it was 1.7 to 1. Now, the male suicide rate hasn't changed a lot over that period, but the female suicide rate has pretty well halved. So, I mean, by the feminist logic, women's mental health has really improved over the last 30 years, and I see nobody claiming that. It's crazy. It is, it's reactive depression. It is a response to pressure that humans can't endure.
Yep. Anyway, so despite this whole blocking attempts by the BBC, you secured 153 votes in your constituency, and your colleague, father's rights activist Ray Berry, secured 63 votes. How much of this is the result of tactical voting? How much of this is the result of actual support or lack of support for J4MB's policies?
Well, it's interesting. We actually had very good engagement. We know whenever we'd speak to people on the street, or particularly about, I mean, our main area of focus, I guess, was, fathers' access to children and vice versa. People really engaged with it, but the vote count didn't reflect that, and I think it was partly to do with voters' lack of conviction. Even if they agreed with our arguments, perhaps they couldn't see what we could do. After all, we're only standing 2 candidates. I mean, one of the great problems for small parties in the UK is the first past the post system. And we've just had the most extraordinary example of that. Now, the UK Independence Party got 3.9 million votes, and which led to 1 MP. The Scottish National Party got fewer than half those number of votes, 1.4 million, I mean, barely more than a third. And they got 56 seats out of 59 in Scotland. It is just extraordinary.
Yes, and I looked into some of the seats were earned by Conservatives, and if you look at the votes in there, it seems like 70% of the constituency didn't want the Conservatives in there. Yet the Conservatives have won, and the similar thing could be said in some of the Labour seats. At least the SNP earned most of their seats with a reasonable number.
They had pretty well exactly 50% of the vote.
So at least if we are to believe in democracy, at least that has some democratic legitimacy. But yeah, I mean, I think the problem with the first past the post system is quite known, and I don't know, most of Europe doesn't use the system like that. Usually it's a mixture of the two.
Right.
If I remember correctly, it's a mixture of the two in Germany, isn't it, Jon?
Yeah, exactly. You have basically 2 votes. In the first vote, you vote for a candidate, which is basically like the British system, and then the second vote goes for a party, and that's proportional representation.
Okay.
Yeah, that seems like a model that would help a little bit more the small parties.
Yeah. Well, I think that something that one of our big challenges for 2020 is to make a clearer case for why a vote for us isn't a wasted vote. And part of that is going to be that we're hoping to stand in 50 or more seats next time, and we already have funding streams in place for the deposits of 11 candidates, and I'm hoping within the coming month we'll have the remainder. So people are going to see that this is part of a bigger thing, and success is not about getting an MP elected. I mean, after all, if UKIP require 3.9 million votes to get 1 MP, the game for J4MB is not about getting MPs as such, although that would be fantastic. It's about getting enough votes in marginal seats so that the candidate for our target party, which could be Labour or Conservative, will fail, and I think that's just very achievable.
And
Yeah,
I guess
and we're also planning. It'll be nearer the time that we announce whether it's Labour or Conservatives. But under our system, we could leave it until 3 or 4 weeks before the election before we declared which one. So it could be that the mainstream media could get quite interested in exactly which party J4MB is going to pitch against.
Jon?
What is interesting is, since we were just talking about the case of UKIP, is that they sort of demonstrate that you can have quite a significant impact on policy without even getting anyone or just getting one person elected only. Because you've already seen that some of the parties are sort of moving somewhat against immigration to sort of cut off UKIP voters, and Cameron with his promise of holding a EU referendum in case he wins was clearly designed to keep people from voting UKIP and voting Conservatives instead.
No, it's a very good point. And of course, the Green Party, I think they have the one MP still, but they've moved the other parties. There's no doubt. So no, it's a good point. You know, I mean, if all, not all we do, but if we just make parties, you know, less anti-male, that'll be something, and you know, it'll be a step on the path to doing away with anti-male policy directions altogether.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and since we talk about the success, I mean, as you said, it's quite difficult to, you said in the interview that you had with Paul a few days ago, it's difficult at this stage to measure success, but considering overall, that is both the campaign itself, the attention garnered, and even maybe the result, would you consider overall that this campaign has been a success?
Oh, a huge success. We had a mainstream media breakthrough in the months before the election. And now that just wouldn't have happened if we weren't standing at the elections. I mean, I keep saying it. I'm sure people are bored of hearing it, but it makes a difference when you're a political party. People, you know, it's kind of a serious move to make. It's also the way to start getting some decent funding, and it gives you media exposure. And you know, I mean, most of the media exposure we've had right across the political spectrum has been highly critical. But very little of that criticism has related to our policy positions. And there's also been virtual media silence about our results, which is quite interesting to us, which makes me think that the media believe that we might just go away. Well, we're not going to go away, obviously. And in fact, we're more and more optimistic about our prospects at the next general election.
Yeah, and even the media breakthrough took a while. I mean, you founded the party in 2013, and the breakthrough came something like in January this year.
That's right. That's right.
So yeah, it took a while, but yeah, I can't disagree with that. I mean, the whole exposure would not have happened had you not been a political party. Now, let's talk about a little bit about policies. I mean, several individuals within the non-feminist sector have. Let's say complained, although I'd rather say whined, that some of your rather rightist policies have played a negative role in the final result. The most exemplified policies that I've seen around the segment that hangs on Facebook was your party's stance on abortion and on single-sex education. Now, how much merit do you think there is in these positions taken by these kinds of individuals? I mean, why do you think it is so extreme to some people to just say, okay, let's have in Britain the same abortion law that exists in Germany, in Denmark, or Finland? Why? What is so extreme?
Well, I've got to be honest, Lucian. I spend very little time on Facebook. So I mean, I'm perhaps unaware of, you know, some of those criticisms, but I mean, in the case of abortion, as you know, we have a 24-week limit, and now it's nearly 50 years since the 1967 Abortion Act, and medical science has, you know, marched on. So we have potentially in British hospitals today a situation where one medical team in one operating theatre is saving the life of a 24-week-old fetus, and in the next operating theatre it's killing a 24-week-old fetus, and we find that just utterly morally indefensible. And we've had, I mean, in the criticisms we've had in the mainstream media, I struggle to. I think one journalist may have alluded to it, but you're right. It's, I mean, 13 weeks or around there is the norm in most of Europe, as I understand. We just have this appalling 24-week figure still.
Yeah, I mean, think of Sweden, which is probably the most quote-unquote liberal country when it comes to abortion. Even Sweden has a 16-week limit.
Yeah.
And most of Europe is somewhere between 12 and 14. That's why I don't understand why it's so it's viewed as such an extremist position to take in Britain. I mean, I really don't think. And with regards to single-sex education, I've seen. I'll abstain from giving names, but you know, we've seen individuals who whined about the position on single-sex education, and those who want more detail about that can look for my previous interview with Mike that was before the elections. There we detailed a bit more about that. Why is it so extremist to talk about voluntary or the existence of an alternative single-sex education? You don't even have to agree with it.
I think just the idea of an environment where women can't, you know, where women are not there in big numbers, they're not influencing everything, you know, dictating the culture. I think.
Well, but they are. I mean, if it's all women school.
No, exactly. But of course, I mean, our proposal was for communities to have the option of having single-sex schools with all-male teaching staffs. And you can imagine to a feminist that is the nearest thing to hell that they could imagine.
I mean, I don't even have to agree with it. I mean, the idea of having an option sounds pretty sensible.
Yeah. And then likewise, I mean, it's not something that we put in a manifesto, but you know, I think a case could be made for all girls' schools with mainly female staffs. But I mean, there are just so many boys now growing up with single mothers, have no male role models. There probably won't be a single male teacher in a primary school. Fewer than a third of the teachers in their secondary schools will be men. You know, it is becoming a more and more uncomfortable environment for male teachers. There's no doubt.
Yeah, and from what I hear from Erin Pitty, there are some areas that could be literally called male desert zones.
Yes.
Where a child could grow up until high school without seeing any kind of male authority figure.
Yes,
And that I think that's sad and detrimental to both boys and girls.
Indeed, but here we have a Conservative government that is doing nothing to strengthen the family. It is continuing to encourage single motherhood, and it's just an anti-conservative, basically.
Yeah, so much for the Conservative Party. Let's go further. Dominic Raab, I think it's the pronunciation. It's a British Conservative Party junior Justice Minister, and seems to be right on our alley. Now, emphasis on seems to be. He's on the record saying that feminists are obnoxious bigots for speaking. He's also on the record for speaking up against biased courts, on the gender pay gap myth, and his track record of such staunch positions goes as far back as 2011. So I guess, how sincere do you think Mr. Raab is in his stances?
I think he was sincere, but his more recent statements, you know, on feminist, for example, have been conciliatory. It's so, you know, you really couldn't get into a Cameron cabinet as an outspoken anti-feminist. So now Cameron only has a small majority, and so he's trying to keep people such as Dominic Raab quiet with ministerial appointments.
So I see, junior justice minister. That sounds like something like deputy minister, something like that.
It's something like that. I mean, the departments have a secretary of state and a number of junior ministers reporting to the secretary of state.
Yeah, I guess that would be that would be exactly the opposite as in France. I mean, that position is exactly a secretary of state in France. Okay.
It's probably worth just taking a little tangent out to explain just how feminist Cameron is. I mean, he came to power in 2005 as the head of the Conservatives in opposition, and 4 years later he announced his intention to introduce all-women shortlists, which was something that didn't go down well, as you can imagine, and quite a lot of members of the party, including myself, left. But he's always been feminist-friendly, and in the last government, as you probably know, was a Conservative-led coalition, and quite a number of people said that his pursuit of feminist agendas had something to do with the Liberal Democrats, who are pretty left-wing, and I've got to say I never believed that. So now he has a majority. He has no Liberal Democrats to worry about, and the first thing he does is to reappoint a minister for women and equalities. And he's also making a third of his cabinet ministers women, although women only form 1 in 7 of Conservative MPs. So basically, he's privileging or preferencing women by about 2.35 times over men.
Yeah, and it should also be noted that Cameron is doing that not because those individual women were the most qualified or something, but because he has a long time quota of having at least a third of his cabinet to be women, just because potato. I mean, no other reason.
Exactly. No, I mean, at the end of the day, he wouldn't need that target if a third of the best candidates are women, would they? So it's just the whole thing is just perverse.
Yeah. I looked at Mr. Raab's positions, and I was unable to find those conciliatory ones, but I will trust you on that because you're definitely more familiar with Mr. Rob than I am, or than most of the audience is. So I guess this is just a tactical move by Cameron. I mean, it's nothing as a shift of. I mean, Mr. Rob was a critic of Cameron, not just on feminism. He was a critic on other stuff as well, such as, I don't know, the latest scandal of Human Rights Act, which he doesn't like because it's EU-centric. He was critical of the European arrest warrant gig and things of that nature. But so definitely Mr. Rob is known for being a staunch critic of Cameron.
Yeah.
So essentially, and I've seen an article on Telegraph saying that Cameron has handed most of the junior jobs to his harshest critics. What does that signify?
Oh, okay. Well, let's say he has a majority, I think, of only 13 MPs. So it gives a lot of power to rebel MPs. When he was in coalition with the Lib Dems, he could rely on the Lib Dems supporting him. He didn't need to worry about people like Dominic Raab, but now he has to. So I mean, basically, just bribing him with a good good comfortable position.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no way that Cameron has become less feminist, if you like. There's just no evidence for it. I say the complete opposite. Even the Labour Party never had a formal target of a third of cabinet ministers being women.
Amazing.
Cameron has not reversed a single, to the best of my knowledge, a single feminist agenda point from the Labour Party from 1997 to 2010. And in some areas, he's gone even further. For example, women in the boardroom.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's talk a bit more about future plans. Assuming Britain will still be a EU member by 2020, or by 2019, more precise, do you plan to stand for the European elections in 2009?
Well, the proportional. Yeah, the proportional reps. Well, I mean that of course will be the year before the next UK general elections, but the proportional representation system used in the EU elections is much kinder to small parties than the first past the post system we use in UK elections. But the issue really is about raising public awareness of the parties to get a good number of votes, and for that we'll probably need more mainstream media coverage than we've had so far. But we'd very much like to field a candidate in 2019 if we have the funds. The deposit is £5,000, and you get that back if you get 2.5% of the vote. So
of the national vote?
No, of the vote in the area where you're standing as a candidate.
Yeah, and the area is a bit larger than in the UK elections.
Yes, it is. So, for example, London is one area, and I think there's about 8 or 9 members of the European Parliament come from London. So I live not far from London, so I guess that would be a fairly obvious place to stand. But it's £5,000, and it's £5,000 we could use in the general election. So it's unlikely, but if we have the money, we will do that.
Yeah, £5,000, that would be enough to not just finance 10 candidates.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so with £5,000 you can finance 5, and including their entire campaign. So it doesn't sound like worth.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem like it's worth. And by 2020, and you said you already established some funding streams to get to your target of having 50 candidates for the next general elections. Would you like to explain again how is that supposed to work? Because J4MB has this particularly outstanding feature that you can become a party member even if you live in Papua New Guinea, which is fantastic.
Indeed, and in fact, you could stand for the UK Parliament if you live in Papua New Guinea or anywhere else. So if you want to be one of our candidates, Lucian, you only have to say. So the idea is that it costs £500 to fund a deposit for the UK general election, and we have 5 years to go. So we've introduced party membership for the first time, and the lowest grade or the lowest level of membership is bronze, and that's £8.33 a month, so about 27 pence a day, and that will, by the time the next election comes up, that will have financed a deposit.
Mm-hmm.
So probably on Sunday I'll do an appeal again, because it's I think it's a big part of our strategy for 2020 that we can say we have 50 people. I mean, that is just so far beyond the two that we stood in our first election. I mean, we've learnt a huge amount from our first election, but we just have to step up some gears, and let's have 50 people. I mean, that will make the mainstream media. I just have no doubt of that.
Yeah, because I mean, they can easily ignore two virtually unheard of in the right circles, or in the circles in the media circles. They can certainly ignore two candidates in two constituencies, but it's harder to ignore 50. That's definitely a good point. And 833, that's like 10 euros a month. That's not really quite a huge
let me
amount.
think. 11 or 12, maybe. I'm not sure. I'm not sure the exchange rate just at the moment, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But our first member was Paul Elam, which was nice.
Yeah, 833. Yeah, 1150.
Yeah.
Well, 1150 euros. What can we do with 1150 euros? I don't know. It depends on the country. In Frankfurt, not too much.
But it is, if you look at it on a daily basis, it's just, God, it's. I mean, in the UK, it's half the price of a postage stamp. It's not a lot of money.
Yeah, and the fact that it can finance a change, it's quite remarkable. And let's say something quite politically incorrect here. At the end of the day, Britain has the lingua franca of the world culture. No, seriously. I mean, at the end of the day, it is more important when something happens in Britain than when it happens in Switzerland. I don't like that things are the way they are, but the reality is still this one, and which is the reason why I'm saying this is because our non-English speaking or those who don't have the English as their first language and are listening to us right now should consider either to become party members or to donate from time to time, as I do. I can't become a party member, but from time to time I make sure to send some anonymous donations to G4MB, exactly for this reason. Because at the end of the day, when an angry feminist writes in The Guardian against J4MB, it matters far more than when an angry feminist writes on the equivalent of The Guardian in Switzerland. I'm sorry for Switzerland, not picking on Switzerland. You can say Italy. Same thing.
Yeah. No, it's certainly true. We've always been delighted by the amount of money that we get from outside the UK, and people, I think, get that the breakthrough, the breaking of the dam might just happen here. That there's just a number of things that make it more viable here. I mean, the geography. You can get anywhere in hours. It makes it so much different to somewhere like, the United States or Australia, where even the geography is against you.
Definitely the case in Australia. At least the United States is a big country with a large number of people, and they can be a world in and of itself, which it's kind of the case in most cases. But yeah, definitely Australia is quite a good example of everything being against them. So
we've had a couple of new Canadian members, and they kind of say, look, if you actually do this in the UK, it's going to be just global. That a men's rights party.
Hello?
I mean, it couldn't get much bigger.
Yeah, and the reason why I make this point is because Mike's party is not the first one to try. I mean, there's been in Switzerland. Sometimes it even gets seats in regional parliaments in Switzerland. The men's party. In Austria, I think there was one. I don't think it still exists.
It does exist, though.
It does exist, right? And do they still get some seats in the councils? At one moment, they were at that point in the local elections.
But I'm not exactly up on that.
Yeah, but then again, I mean, those kinds of movements have been existing in Switzerland and Austria for quite some time. In Switzerland for like 15 years. and we barely even heard of them. Whilst J4MB has had in 3 months or 4 months since January far more exposure than the Men's Party in Switzerland had in 15 years, even though the Men's Party in Switzerland actually even gained seats in local councils, in regional parliaments and whatnot.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things about the mainstream media exposure is that well, I go back to the point that it's been hostile right across the political spectrum. But if you look at, most of these things go online after they're in the paper editions, and 95% usually of the comment streams are supportive of us. And the people running these newspapers must sort of figure out that, hey, hang on, we have these people attacking Buchanan and J4MB, and there's just huge support. And the writers of those articles get hauled over the coals. And I think it's one of the things that may have led to the International Business Times commissioning me to write a column recently, which is very nice. I think it was the only mainstream media platform for a men's rights advocate anywhere in the world, and it lasted. It was a fortnightly column. It lasted for exactly 2 columns. I thought, well, I'll start off with something uncontroversial. So I started off with gender balance in the boardroom, because there's nobody on the planet that's disputing our positions on that. And the second one on male suicide, and I think I only used the word feminist once, which was difficult. And then the International Business Times ended the contract. They were very polite, but they said, well, sorry, I should go back a bit. The reason they took me on in the first place was to balance 2 British feminists, 2 young British feminist columnists they had, one of whom was Laura Bates, who was twice a special snowflake, who has twice won our Lying Feminist of the Month awards. And so they wanted me to balance these 2 women, and anyway, so it lasted for 2 columns, and then they ended the agreement, and a week later I found out I'd been replaced by Ali Fogg.
Jesus, seriously?
So much for balance.
And so they balanced up 2 female feminists with a male feminist. I mean, that was just. I mean, why they didn't go the whole hog and take on Harriet Harman, I just don't know.
I mean, yeah, seems legit. Let's balance 2 female feminists with Ali Fogg. I mean, why not Michael Kimmel? I mean, come on. At least that would be utter balance. Although I think Michael Kimmel would out-feminist Laura Bates.
Possibly.
At least Michael Kimmel is versed into the entire nonsense, which is more than I can say with some other feminists. But since we mentioned local elections, have you ever considered local elections, tackling them ever?
No. I think I'm a bit worried that I might get elected.
There you go. You've heard it here first.
That would be a living hell for me, to be a local politician. Can you imagine? Oh my God, no, it's not for me.
Yeah, I guess. You kind of have a point on one hand. On the other hand, considering that Britain now seems to be heading towards a less centralized system, I would guess a local politician would gain some more power than in the past, and thus can influence some of the things. I mean, I was thinking, let's say, if you have a local, what do they call them, social worker, I think, social assistant we call them here, who's treating fathers badly or something like that, a local politician can actually fix that on the spot, much better than a member of the parliament can.
No, I see that, but at the end of the day, the 20 assaults on men and boys that we talk about in our manifesto, they come from the state, from the big state.
Yes, they do.
So, I mean, I'm interested in stopping that flow of assaults, really, from the state, and you can't do that, obviously, at a local level.
Yes, that's true as well. So I guess you're also into the researcher mindset as opposed to the doctor mindset.
Yes.
Are you aware of the comparison?
Yes, I heard it. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, then you've heard it here first, folks. A politician who said, "I'm not going to run there because I'm afraid I might be elected." You don't hear that too often from politicians, you gotta admit. All right, then. I guess this was pretty much all of the questions that I had. I mean, I tried not to repeat things that Paul has already asked. I mean, if you think that I haven't covered anything, everyone in the audience can go look for Mike's interview with Paul, which was made right after the elections, I think 1 or 2 days after the results were announced. I tried to cover things that Paul could not have asked because he's less aware of the details, which is fine given how many things Paul has on his plate. Jon?
Well, I have a question that's not directly related to men's rights, but sort of to this show, and that is about the upcoming EU referendum. How do you see the chances of that actually succeeding?
The case for Europe for the EU has never really been made by the British political classes. I think when it is, I mean, you know, David Cameron is a Europhile. The political classes in general are, and I think when the case for the EU is put strongly, and the risks of pulling out are made known, I think British people will vote to stay in. I don't think that the EU will concede a great deal. I don't think the British people will take the risk of departing.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think you're right there. I think it might sort of go in a similar fashion as the Scottish independence referendum, where there was a lot of very vocal sort of campaigning for the yes side, but in the end, people were still afraid and voted no.
No, I think that's a very good parallel. But I mean, there's so much about the EU to just loathe. I mean, Viviane Reding, for one, you know, who is on record as wanting a United States of Europe. I mean, God help us. But no, I think it's. I can't see Britain leaving.
That is unfortunate because I also can't see the EU being reformed from the inside.
No.
And unfortunately, the British influence is not really that big as it should be or as it could be, especially when you have a Europhile political class, which, to be fair, all nations of Europe have a Europhile political class.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Admittedly, not through so much orthodox means, so to speak, but that's of little importance. But I think you're right. The case for the EU hasn't been made yet. Much to the desperation of the former Maoist José Barroso, who's been asking the Conservatives in particular to make the case for the EU. I guess that's still yet to happen, and not just in Britain. The PMP in France is still trying to make that case against the rising tide of support for Front National, and they're kind of failing. I guess there is some reason to fear of this. Quite frankly, I fear more about the situation in France than I fear in Britain. I mean, in Britain, at the very least, the Eurosceptics are still civilized and they make their cases thoroughly. You can disagree with them, but at least you can see that it's a good argument and it's not made out of stupidity, which is not really the case in other places, such as France, where the arguments are quite wow. Okay then, I guess with all these being said, any other questions, Jon?
No, can't think of any right off the top of my head.
Okay, Mike.
I just have one more.
Go ahead.
Just one more thing.
Go ahead.
I mean, after the election, we saw the three major party leaders resign.
Yep.
And the Labour Party at some point in the coming year will elect a new leader. And one of the front runners is Yvette Cooper, who is a grotesque. I mean, she's Harriet Harman, really.
Yeah,
she will be just, I mean, she is the Shadow Home Secretary, and she was on record as well. She wanted to indoctrinate schoolboys into respecting women, girls, and so on, which basically means you know what that means, feminist indoctrination. And she planned to introduce a violence against women and girls bill. So it'll be fairly grotesque for everyone, well, for men in particular.
Meanwhile, the original Harriet Harman is the interim leader, isn't she?
Yes, she is. Yeah, she's a deputy leader of the party. So yes, she's a caretaker leader. Yeah.
Caretaker leader. I like how that sounds. I mean, doesn't she think is stereotyping her to be a caretaker?
Possibly so. Possibly.
And again, I mean, I'm still surprised that she hasn't changed her name from Harriet Harman to Harriet Harperson. I mean,
yes. Well, of course. I mean, she's been married over 30 years, maybe even 40 years, to a man. I can never remember his name, but he's also now. Harriet Harman was very keen on all women shortlists, except for the constituency where she didn't turn up for an important meeting, and her husband was selected, and is now an MP. So she's never changed her maiden name or her name, and she has one or two daughters who carry her name. I mean, she's just what can I say? Ghastly woman.
Yeah, I remember watching for a debate. I think it happened in Oxford back in the days where mandatory feminist indoctrination was still not mandatory in Oxford, in which there was a woman who was formerly a member of Labour Party and now she was out of politics, and she said, "Look, the feminists in our party were so adamant about electing women into the party and giving power to women and whatnot. And yet, when push came to shove, no woman ran for the presidency of the party."
Yes.
They sort of want women to be in power, sort of in the abstract, but they don't necessarily want power themselves, but just other women.
But
getting into power is a lot of hard work, and it's a lot easier to complain.
But all these things always come back to Dr. Catherine Hackim's preference theory, the sociologist who showed that 4 in 7 British men are work-centered and only 1 in 7 British women. But of course, I mean, professional feminists are very much in that 1 in 7, and they're trying to make the other 6 in 7 women like them, and the other 6 in 7 women don't want to be like them. It's a problem for them.
Yeah, but I mean, even among these women who are work-centered, they're still usually not the types who become leaders, who strive to get to the very top and who are willing to work 16 hours a day to do that.
Yeah, they're work-centered in the abstract, as you said.
Yeah, I mean it's true. I mean I saw that all the time in my 30-year business career that as you went up the organisation, the proportion of people who are men increased, because they were willing to compete and put in crazy hours, and women always say that's really unhealthy in business. But if you draw a parallel with, let's say, athletics, the people who win the medals are the ones who put the hours in. They aren't the people who have work-life balance, are they? Why should it be any difference in business as in athletics?
Yes, absolutely. And one of the reasons why there's such a crap ton of Eastern European female gymnasts is because they were willing to go into crazy schools that would be quite illegal today. I mean, I had the less fortunate. I've been less fortunate in the sense that I was able to actually see the training conditions for female athletes in the 80s, back in the days of Nadia Comaneci and whatnot.
Yes.
And trust me, 100% of those schools would be illegal today.
Wow.
And those girls were willing to put up the hours. And as you say, why should it be different in business?
Yeah. The thing is, if you want to be sort of one of the best or world class at pretty much anything, you just have to put in a crazy amount of work, and you have to sacrifice a lot of other things, and most people are not willing to do that, and I wouldn't be willing to do that either, and that's perfectly fine. But then I can't expect to become a CEO of a large company or a famous politician or something like that. It just doesn't work.
One of the just to go back to business, one of the most interesting losses of a seat the election was a guy called Vince Cable, who was a very left-wing Liberal Democrat MP, business secretary for the whole of the last 5 years, and very much a driver of more women on boards and all this kind of thing. And so he lost the election, much to everyone's surprise, and he's been replaced by a Conservative MP who's said to be a Thatcherite. So, among other things, that means a sort of a meritocrat. So it'll be interesting to see if the British government stops its pressurising of FTSE 100 companies into appointing more female directors.
I've never been able to understand this idea of let's have government force business to employ whomever we want as a government. It just doesn't make it just doesn't compute.
It makes no sense. But there isn't a longitudinal study from anywhere in the world ever that has shown that there's a business case for doing that. And and we have a number of 5 longitudinal studies that say when you artificially drive up the proportion of women on boards, financial performance declines. Well, of course it would, because you're making companies appoint people that they wouldn't freely appoint. So how can it be anything but a negative consequence?
Yeah, it turns out that successful businessmen tend to be quite good at making money, and it shouldn't be surprising.
Yeah, and I think it works the other way around. I mean, if we were to pressure, for instance, let's take the judiciary in my home country. The judiciary in here is female dominated from top to bottom. Not because of any quota or anything, it's just because women want to work in the judiciary far more than men. They don't want to be attorneys. Private attorneys are 85% men, but when it comes to judges, prosecutors, and whatnot, most of them are women. I would think that an artificial quota of men in the judiciary would actually disrupt the whole apparatus and make it worse.
Yeah, and I mean, if it's mostly women who want to do these jobs, then what is the problem?
None at all. None at all. But what I'm trying to say is that it doesn't work just with let's get more women in there. I think it works the other way around, and also works with any other arbitrary quota. Let's have more left-handed people into the boards, or let's have more blonde people in the boards, or whatnot. It's just you're putting people who don't want to be there, and those who are supposed to appoint them also don't want them there, and it's just a whole clusterfuck.
But it's unique to women, of course. I mean, you're quite right. I mean, no one would seriously say that we need more left-handed people on FTSE 100 boards. But somehow women get this past, don't they? That it makes sense, to say yes, we need more women. It's just crazy.
Well, so some parts of Europe, Sweden, I'm looking at you, are also thinking of not just to put more women, but also to put more non-whites. For instance, an IT company in Sweden was slammed recently in the press because they didn't have enough Syrian directors. And I was thinking, how many IT companies in Syria have, how many Swedish workers do they have? And do they even give a damn? And yes, Syrian IT companies actually exist, and they're quite decent, some of them. But I doubt they have any Swedish workers at all. And I don't care. Why should that be a problem? So I guess it's not only limited to women. I mean, if you can stretch it as much as you want, and it just doesn't make sense. But yeah, I really hope you're right on that, and maybe now with the loss of the main voice to get more women on boards by the force of the state from within the government, maybe that kind of zeal will be diminished a little bit.
Yeah, because I mean, at the moment, the longer term goal, well, the short term goal is to get 25% of FTSE 100 directors women, and they're almost there. The longer term goal is to have 50-50 gender balanced boards on the FTSE 350, which will require a tenfold preferencing of women.
Amazing.
But that's it'll be interesting to see if they keep that. My guess is that they will stay. They'll this is a train which only goes in one direction.
Yeah, well, what I would also be interested is how much will the companies be willing to put up with? I mean, it's one thing to ask them
Well,
to give a twofold preference to women for a limited period of time. Well, they might swallow that, and I guess some of them actually did. But when you ask them for the next 10 years to have a tenfold preference for women just because potato, I would guess that some companies would start looking at how much cash they might lose from such a move, and they might
but
not
but, he-
like
but
it.
he- yeah, Lucian, here's the interesting thing. Not one executive from the FTSE 350 has objected to any of this. And our hunch on that is that these things will not stop at the FTSE 350. They'll go to ever smaller companies. And the bigger a company you are, the more that you can finance these or absorb these social engineering initiatives. They will be crippling to small and medium-sized companies. So,
Mhm.
so, so we think there's an element that big business is basically sort of accepting this to damage their smaller competitors.
Yeah, I think you might be correct on that. I remember, I think it was from UKIP, that particular MEP who made made a similar case in the European Parliament. If you remember, Jon, when they covered the Women on Boards bill, that was surprisingly buried somewhere in the European Parliament. Nobody has ever heard of it since we've covered it at that moment. Which also had a similar provision to even include SMEs, small and medium enterprises, to have
Wow.
gender balance within their leadership. And mind you, some of these, and you know, that was the moment when I even saw the MEP from Die Linke, Die Linke being the Communist Party essentially. It's the party that ruled in Eastern Germany. And so that one saying, look, I have construction workers in my constituency. They would scalp me if I go and tell them that you have to fire five. You have 5 construction workers and 2 men who founded the company, and have to fire one of the founders and 3 of the workers to put women in there. But why?
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess you're correct on that. I mean, if it comes down to it, and it becomes more common to force even smaller competitors, that might be a reason for the big businesses to not overtly support it, but at least roll over and quietly or tacitly accept it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think an important point is just that they're afraid of being singled out by the press as being anti-women, and that even might lead to some sort of selective enforcement procedures if they sort of take a public stand against these kinds of laws.
But I understand that Angela Merkel had to accept something along these lines, didn't she, as part of the coalition? Some
Yes,
increased women on boards in Germany. And I say that as somebody who I was in procurement for nearly 30 years and dealt with a lot of German companies. I mean, just so impressive. They were just extraordinary. And I remember very, very few female executives, I've got to say, at the top of our German suppliers.
yeah, that's sort of a fact that is much lamented in the German media, and we now have this quota. I'm not entirely sure when it's supposed to go into effect. I think in 2018 or 2020, either of those. It's going to be a 40% in the supervisory council of these larger companies. So we're only talking about a couple hundred of people here, but it's sort of a first step.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in here we don't have this tradition, and by here I mean in Europe, we don't have this tradition of having one company to just say no because no. And maybe the parallel isn't quite fortunate in here, but this is the only example that I can come up with now. It's Chick-fil-A, for instance, in the U.S., who just said, no, we're not going to do it your way. Fuck off. We don't have this kind of tradition in Europe to have a big company, I don't know, let's say Volkswagen, or a relatively significant company, to just say, no, we're not just going to roll over, we're not going to accept it. Buzz off, none of your business. I've yet to see that coming from anywhere.
But in the UK, you would think that the employers' organisations, in the UK, the Confederation of British Industries, the CBI, would be opposing this, but then they've been supporting more women on boards for years. They've been driving the agenda, and you know, even when you present them with the facts that show there's a causal link between more women on boards and financial decline, they still go in that direction. It's the most extraordinary thing.
Mm-hmm. All right then. I guess these are the questions that we kind of had. We're towards the end of the show. Anything else that you want to add that you didn't get the chance to add till now, Mike?
No, just like to invite anybody who's listening to go on our website, j4mb.org.uk, become a member, and sponsor one candidate for 2020.
That seems nice. Then I guess that would be it. Jon, any final message for our listeners?
Take the red pill.
This has been a production of A Voice for Man. Lucian, Vâlsan and his guests, thank you for listening to the Voice of Europe. A Voice for Man radio is not corporate media and everything runs on donations. So please consider visiting avoiceforman.com and make a donation. We would also like to thank the artists, De Prima Terra, Bezna, Cristian Buica, the Iranian band Arsames, the DDG Project, and all the other artists that offered us their songs to use under Creative Commons license. Special thanks go to www.pacdv.com/sounds for putting the sounds of the jingles at our disposal. We would also want to remind the listeners to take the red pill. Thank you for listening to us and have a great evening. Ați ascultat Vocea Europei.